Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa and Jojy. So welcome back to the Deconstructed Woman podcast. Today we're talking about a topic that I think transcends all generations. And as Jojy and I were getting prepared for this, I had put down a couple of notes. I was just reading in the last couple of weeks, actually, a couple of different blogs about why do women put themselves last. And I think that there's a lot of pieces and parts to that, but I think it kind of goes back to something we were just talking about in our last episode on feminism about traditional views and traditional ways of viewing the roles in the household, as well as, roles, whether you work in or out of the home, because a lot of those traditional views of, women being the selfless person who takes care of others and the nurturing type of person kind of pulls for I put everyone first and put myself last. And I was telling Jojy that this is kind of I'm in this right now. So Jojy, I don't know where you are in that process, or I don't know if it's a process, but I feel like hopefully eventually I have more motivation or more movement towards not putting myself last. But for right now, I'm in this. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
I definitely think that it has a lot to do with the stage of life you're in. I mean, I think that when you are single, you have more of an opportunity to focus on yourself because, you're by yourself. And then as you get into a couple relationship and then start a family, all of a sudden your life is not your own anymore, right? You've got to put all these other people first. And that challenges you in many ways. And as women, especially if you're a nursing mom, I mean, you're sort of tied to this child and this child's survival depends a lot on you. And so there's a natural assumption that, you're of course going to put your child first. And that I think just continues through the child rearing years. And then, high school gets very complicated. And I think as you launch your children into college or into their, vocation or their career, whatever they're going to do, then you start to get some of that time back. And that's when I think that you have the opportunity really to find yourself again. And so that's the phase that I've been in now for, I would say, probably almost going on 8 years, where my daughter went to college. And so we were empty nesters. We got really used to being by ourselves. I only have one child. And so, that I didn't have other children coming up behind her. And so when she went to college, we went into empty nest right away. And then my husband and I had to sort of redefine our roles and our relationship and our day and our time together. And so then I was able to invest in what do I want to do now, because I felt like, okay, I checked off the child rearing and checked off being a partner. And now we're two individuals trying to figure out what we're going to do in the last phase of our life. And so I think it does come. It just takes a long time. And the more children you have, the longer that child rearing period lasts. And truthfully, the longer you have to wait to get. And so I think it's coming. But for you, with your children being so young, you've got quite a number of years ahead of you. But I would also recommend that you adopt some of those ideas now and carve out some of that time for yourself, however you do that, because it is the only way to replenish yourself. Because, that statement about you can't give to anybody else if you don't have for yourself is really a truism. And so you do have to find a way to recharge yourself so that you can fulfill all the roles that you have, especially at this time in your life, because you're in the thick of it right now.
Right. Yeah. And I would say that I think that the amount of podcasts and blogs and things that I consume on a weekly basis, most of them are by women who are saying that exact thing. They're saying mommy burnout and different terms of you can't, if your buckets, like there's a whole thing on buckets, and if your bucket's empty and you have nothing to kind of give, I think that a lot of times we still keep giving because to not give seems selfish. And if I and self-care, I heard somebody the other day say, like, I hate the term self-care, and I am right there. I know that it is vital. It's Burnout is something near and dear to my heart, something that I've studied for many years because it's something that I want to reduce in society in general. But self care, for some reason, I don't know if there's a new term. I'm sure it will evolve at some point. But the term self care to me seems selfish and it doesn't really translate to what I need. But the discussion that I was just listening to was about Joanne Crone, who I follow. She's the No Guilt Mom, and she does a lot of, was it the air mask, the oxygen mask on the airplane. Like, everyone says, like, put your oxygen mask on first before you help your children. And that concept, my husband says it to me all the time, and then, like, I hear you, but it just doesn't translate in my brain because for some reason being selfish seems, maybe I go off the rails, like I'm just going to be selfish and let everything go. And I know that wouldn't happen, but I don't know where that middle ground is, because I feel like that's too foreign to me. Throwing myself and having empty buckets sounds like that's more comfortable in some ways. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the difficulty for me, though, is sort of the anger that I feel at times where society doesn't seem to impress that upon men as much,
Hmm.
right? Can you imagine men sitting around talking about how selfish they feel if they're not taking care of the house and their children and their spouse and, all the other things that go on? I think that's the part that I get frustrated about, is the fact that why should we feel guilty and bad or selfish when we are productive members of society and we have been sold this, bag of goods that we're going to be superwoman, that we're going to be a working adult in society and raise children and be a fulfilling partner to your spouse and the most evolved part of yourself that you can be. And like, how is that all possible? There's only so many hours in the day. And what I feel is that, and maybe it is, and maybe it's just not in the experiences that I've had. I mean, I've got two brothers, I had a father, I had a husband. I don't hear those conversations in those circles. Maybe they're happening in the younger man, maybe in the folks who are 30 years old or 40 years old. Maybe those conversations are more equal now between men and women, and both genders are looking for, I don't know, maybe men and women are both fighting to not be selfish. That's not the era I was brought up in, nor that I experienced when I was raising my children. I resented the fact that, if I wanted to do a girls' night, I had to justify that somehow. Whereas, my husband hanging out with his friends or going to the bar or whatever was just expected. But both of us were working parents. And
Hmm.
so, and there was more acceptance from family that, of course, my husband was going to go do that and he should do that. But I should be at home taking care of my children. And so I don't know where that double standard came from. I mean, I think I know where it came from, but are you saying, what do you feel? I mean, you're in that younger crowd. Do you feel like that's more that both genders are striving to be now selfish and do everything they can for their children? Or do you still feel that with your age group, that still feels like it's more pressing on women to fulfill that, and maybe men are still off the hook, or have they also been given that expectation now?
I'm like over here, like shaking my head up and down and like back and forth. No, I mean, I was actually thinking like we'd probably have to delve in. I don't know, maybe a younger generation of early 20s, maybe they're different, but I think everything that you described is exactly what it's like in my household. And my husband, he will outright say, I don't want to do this, or he makes time for himself. And I see that. And he's a really good example of what I should be doing. He just carves it out. Like, he runs every morning. This is a good example because I think that this kind of, I mean, it's twofold because quite frankly, I don't want to run every morning, but he runs every morning because it makes him feel good. He's in great shape. Like it's something that he does for himself. And he, if he has to get up a little earlier, like he makes that time for himself. And so a couple of months ago, I was like, okay, I want to start running. And there was no time in the day for me to do that. And I said, okay, well, we'll have to figure out something. He's like, well, yeah, you just tell me when you want to run. And I'm like, but you run in the morning. So by the time he gets back, I've gotten the kids ready, and taken them down for breakfast. And I'm getting in the shower as soon as he gets back. And he finishes up breakfast. I get ready for work. We get the kids that go to school on the bus, and I go off to work, and then I come home. And by then it's, getting the evening routines, whatever we have for the evening dinner, and then bed. And like dinner, clean up, bed, whatever goes in between there. And it's like there was no time block that I could find to go running. And he was just make the time. And I was like, no, I threw up my hands. And again, I'm not really motivated for running, so maybe that's part of it. But the point is that I couldn't see in my mind where I could fit in exercise, because it just didn't seem like that would work. Yet he does it every single day. And one of us has to be here because our kids are too small. They can't, we can't go running together. I'm sure that maybe would come, like you were talking about, like later on in life when, maybe the kids are out of the house or they're older to the point where we could leave them, like they can sleep in and I can go running with him. But right now, somebody always has to be home. And yeah, he could, stay with the kids and I could run the evenings or something like that. Like I'm sure we could figure it out. But to me, it was, I don't see it. And so that's no longer a priority for me, even though it's something I'd like to do. And so again, I think it was okay. I just put my exercise and my health went on the back burner because everybody else needed to get something. Like I needed to take care of them.
Yeah. And I do think that, I was thinking about, when my daughter was in elementary school. I mean, I didn't even think about working out in elementary school just because you got to pick them up from daycare and then you bring them home, you got to feed them, you got to put them to bed, and you don't spend very much time with them because you're working and you feel like every waking moment, you've got to like really get everything out of that moment before you put them to bed. Right. And so I do remember in high school, when she was in high school, I started working out after work. But then it really had a negative effect on me because now it's like I couldn't get out of work because I felt like I wasn't in control of my own day. And then I was rushing to work out. I was rushing to get home. I was rushing to get dinner on the table. And I felt like I just added one more thing to make myself crazier. And I think that I did worse for my health than if I just skipped it, because I added that much more stress to one more thing in a busy day. And so I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it could just be, as simple as, maybe doing 5 minutes of meditation before you leave your car and go to your work and just make that transition, or do that on the way home, or, or listen to some music, or I don't know. I think it doesn't have to be big things. I think that's what I always thought in the past was it's got to be not, I mean, I'm not a runner either. So for me, running would be like torturing myself. But at the same time, I think you do think like, oh, I have to do say if I love, an exercise class, I've got to do an hour of hot yoga, or I have to do 30-minute class here. I've got to go work out on all the machines. I don't think it has to be all of that. I think that when you've got multiple children and they're all under a young age, you have to take the little time you can get and you have to really value that and find a way to do that really well. Because I do think that if you don't find a way to carve out some time, I do think that it eats away at you and you may find yourself resenting, some things that you're doing. And then you feel guilty for resenting it because that's what you should do, and it's just a vicious cycle, I think, for us as women. This whole, wanting to be superwoman and do everything, I think is just something that, and I think that's what I thought about with this topic is how is it that we are okay with that? How is it that this has allowed to happen? Why is it so easy for women to ignore themselves and to put everybody else first? Like, that's where I think I'm at in this stage. I think I'm more like the angry woman. Like, gosh, I spent, 40 years of my life putting everybody ahead of me. And there was a stage in my probably mid 30s to mid 40s that I was like, when is it going to be about me? Like, when is it my turn? And that was sort of my mantra for many angry years, because I think I was just so done with it all. And nobody would cut you a break. Nobody at work, nobody, at home. You still had all these things to do. You're doing laundry at odd hours. And it's interesting because when my husband retired a couple years ago, I actually had to tell him, I'm not going to make dinner anymore. Like, you're retired. You're going to be home all day long. The least you can do is make dinner. And that was actually like a vigilant conversation we had to have, because he doesn't know how to cook. And I'm like, well, you got 8 hours a day to figure it out. Like, I don't expect like a 3-course meal, but I do expect something, and it was ludicrous that I would work all day long and be expected to come home and make dinner because you're telling me you don't know how to cook. So that was a negotiation that happened. And I can report back that that has worked out great. And, he has thankfully, like, Blue Apron and all those little meal packages came out the same time he retired. So we've been using some of that, and that takes some of the responsibility off. But I think that as your relationship matures and you have more free time, you're still negotiating different things and standing up for yourself and your time. And I think that you learn how to do that more effectively as your kids grow up and you get more time. And now you're going to want some of that time for yourself, because I don't know if I would have had the wherewithal to have that conversation 10 years ago. I would have just assumed that's what I should do. And though I don't like it, that's what I'm going to do. Whereas, 5 years ago or less than 5 years ago, I just said, no, that's not going to happen. This is the line in the sand that I draw. Like, I've been cooking for X amount of years and managing work, and now it's your turn. Figure it out. You're a smart person. You'll figure it out. And so I think it will happen. It just takes time. And you learn and you grow and you try different things and you negotiate and you fail and you try again. And it's just a cycle.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea of, like, again, I think there's a lot of parallels. And as you were talking, I'm like sitting here like, good job. But I mean, that's the thing, the sad part is, why was the expectation, or why did your husband not just say, oh, well, she's working, so I will just make dinner? Like you said, like, there had to be this discussion about it. And there was no kind of, oh, this is what I should do. And I find myself, and I don't know if you wanted to comment on that. So I'll wait for a moment, because I was gonna jump into, like, I have a lot of those conversations on a daily basis. But does that strike you as interesting, that it wasn't just like a, here, I'm retired, I'm moving into this role? Like, you had to have a discussion about it.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think that he was already thinking that there was going to be some, sort of rebalancing, but because he never cooked, I think he just thought that was off the table. Like, tell me anything else, I'll do it, but I don't know how to cook. And I was like, well, I mean, like everything else, it is something, but you're right, absolutely. I mean, and if I hadn't pushed for it, it wouldn't have happened.
Right. Well, I think, like, even just recently on Friday night, my husband said, I'm taking the day off from doing the dishes. And he does most of the dishes throughout the day. And then when I come home, I do whatever's left. But, I know for a fact, if he takes a day off of the dishes during the day, then they pile up. And then I've worked an 8-hour day. I come home and I don't want to do, an hour's worth of dishes. Like, it's just a lot for me. After I want to be able to sit down, but he said, "Well, I'm taking the day off. Like, I'm just gonna, not do them today." And I got so angry. And so it goes back to that discussion of, like, those resentments and burnout. And I was, again, listening to a podcast about, how, when you have those resentments, and that kind of, you're putting yourself last and you're emptying your buckets and you don't have any reserves, that it does trickle into your relationships with your spouses, with your partners, with your children, and even, in if you're working with coworkers, with friends, family. Like, it kind of, slithers its way into your life. And so I think that's even more reason why we have to kind of step back and be able to say, okay, how can I take care of myself and ensure that I'm not completely depleted, so that I can function? But it's, easier said than done, I think, in a lot of ways. I think that you've given me some hope that eventually, like, that shifting into kind of the next phase of life may produce maybe more time, and maybe, right now is not the phase that I'm going to get into the best shape of my life. Yes, it would be great, but maybe, that's not where we're at. And maybe, my husband and I can run together in maybe 10 years from now. Who knows? But I think that process, I very much, even in the last couple of years, I got this new planner and I set goals for myself. I've never really been a planner person, but I really like this planner. And, I set goals for myself to have a coffee date once a month with a friend, read a book, go to our book club, and have a date night. And that was something in the last 38 years I had never set aside or made a goal to do those things. And all of a sudden I was like, okay, this is my goal once a month to do these 4 things. And, I think that was a shift for me to be able to even say, these are the things I want to do to replenish myself or take care of myself. I don't know if it's self-care, but it definitely makes me feel good. So I guess it probably is.
Right. And I think that that's probably something also to think about is that, you know, anything that re-energizes you or puts those deposits back into your internal bank counts. So it doesn't have to be necessarily meditation, yoga, and exercise, or whatever other people do. And I think that's the other challenge too, is that you're always going to, I forever, whatever reason, was surrounded by women who wanted to be the perfect mom and wanted to do all this stuff with their children, and I just am not wired that way. And so, though I have a very close relationship with my child, I wasn't, I wouldn't describe myself as like this maternal. I love independence. I love my child to be independent. And so we are very independent, but very, very close. But I seem to be surrounded by women that, in my perception, just wanted dependency and their children to depend on them. And it just made me like, oh my gosh, like, is there something wrong with me? And is that what I should be like? Am I not as good of a mom? And like, I think there's always situations that make us feel bad about who we are. And even as I was driving my daughter to college, I said to her, and I was waiting for that sucker punch moment when I said, how would you grade me as a mom? Was I there for you? Did I do everything I needed to do? Like, did I let you down? Because I've always been career driven and I've always wanted, that was really where a lot of my self identity came from. And I was sort of holding my breath. And my daughter said, Mom, you showed me that a career is important and that you can be anything you want to be. And she said, not any mom, nobody else could have showed me that but you. And I took the biggest breath of relief, because if she had said, yeah, you let me down here and here and here, and why was I the last kid to be picked up from daycare, and, this and that. I mean, it could have been extremely hurtful. And because I would have taken it really personally, because I worried about that for 18 years. And then that was like the moment of truth. And she was kind enough and generous enough not to put it all on me. But, you never know. It just, I think women we're so fragile when it comes to our mothering and, our partner relationships and our friendships. And so, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you put out that big of a question to somebody who might be still not in your favor or not like you. But, it was just a timely conversation for us to have. But I think we are fragile, and I think we need to be mindful of that too, because it's amazing how devastating a conversation, or what a flippant conversation with your child or your partner could land. And it's going to stick with you for a while. So you got to be sort of careful what you ask too, I've learned.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of I'm sitting here like, oh, I'm reflecting on that conversation, because I think that is such a beautiful moment that you had with your daughter. And I think I can only hope that I can carry that on for my all of my children, not just my daughters, but my son too. That they do see the worth in the things that we do, and maybe they do see the sacrifices, and they do see that mom goes to work and mom does a lot, but not in a hopefully not in a bad way of like, oh, mom wears herself down and doesn't take care of herself, but in a way that they see, thanks. Hopefully someday they just say thanks, mom. That's all I would really that's all I would really
Yeah.
want.
Yeah,
But,
it'll be to be fair, it'll be a long time coming. But I would definitely say probably between like 18 and 22. I think they see us as real people and not as their parents. I don't think they have any acknowledgement of everything we go through just because it's it's not their perspective. So they're not going to give you that, but it does come. But just like our own evolution, when we were able to see our parents and see everything they sacrificed for us, that takes a certain level of maturity, and which doesn't happen for a certain amount of time. But I have to say, Lisa, here we are again, where, to be honest with you, I haven't scratched the surface of my comments and my questions about this topic. So once again, we'll probably have to have like a second part to this podcast and this topic because there's so much more to talk about.
there is. I know I was thinking about even the discussion of self-identity and even the evolution of, I mean, what you just mentioned, the evolution of our parents and, that transition. I think that that could be another full podcast episode too. So I think we'll probably try to wrap up here since we are trying to keep these relatively short, but at the same time, there's just so much packed into our discussion. So Joji, thank you for all of that because I appreciate the hope that you give me. But I think there is a lot to discuss when we talk about, as again, that's the name of this podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. We're breaking things down and kind of looking at them and finding that there's a lot to discuss here. So we'll wrap it up for this episode, but thank you again for joining us. Feel free to email us at thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. If you have ideas for our podcast episodes that you would like to see us discuss next, we would love to even bring you onto the episode if you'd like to join the conversation in real time, or feel free to leave us comments about how, if you enjoyed this, and we hope to talk to you next time. So thank you, Joji, for joining us, and we'll end here.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.